Without any further ado, please welcome our voices for this evening. A fellow Buffalo Bison Hall of Famer who broadcasted Bison games from 1983 to 1995, and then did TV games only for 2 years before he became the voice of the Nashville Predators, Pete Weber. Joining Pete will be his broadcast partner in Buffalo from 1989 to 1993, and the voice of the Pittsburgh Pirates for the past 28 years, Greg Brown. It gives me great pleasure and a true honor to introduce this evening's leadoff hitter, who has called every sport imaginable in a distinguished career that has earned him 8 National Sportscaster of the Year awards and 23 Emmy awards. But it's baseball that he loves talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Costas. Bob, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Greg. Hi, Pete.
Why don't you begin with what is your background here, Bob?
What is my background? Well, you and I became acquainted sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was in Buffalo more frequently than I am these days, because the Bills were a power then, as you recall, and they may be on their way to reestablishing that status. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but they're doing pretty well this year. So many NBC broadcasts came from Buffalo, especially when they were in the playoffs. I wasn't doing the play-by-play. Dick Enberg was the lead guy, but I hosted all the studio shows, and then we would do the games from the site at the Super Bowl or in the playoffs. So that's how we became acquainted. And you took me out to what was then the new ballpark, and I told you then how enchanted I am and still am by minor league baseball. I had done minor league games when I was a student at Syracuse into a tape recorder. I'd go to that old ramshackle MacArthur Stadium, which may predate Greg's days and Pete's days, but maybe not. Talk about a dump. You had to really love baseball to go out there. And I would just take my tape recorder when I was 19, 20 years old and do a few innings, go back and listen to it and recoil in horror, saying, I'll never be any good. This is just god-awful and terrible. But things changed a bit over time. And I've often said, although my lucky circumstances in broadcasting took me to different places when I was still in my 20s, one of the things I wish that I could have done was a few seasons of minor league baseball. That whole Bull Durham thing resonates with me.
Well, the perfect person to follow me then is someone who did a number of minor league baseball games, Pete Weber.
Thank you very much, Mike, Bob. And I love hearing that dedication to the game of baseball. Did it not begin in your parents' driveway, tuning in the car?
Yeah, it did. And for those who might not be familiar, by the way, this is the backdrop that we use when I'm on from a distance, when I'm unable to be there in person. This is the backdrop we use, and we call it Studio 24/7 at the Major League Baseball Network. Obviously, Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle symbolizing that. But yeah, when those guys were active players, my dad, who was a baseball fan, yes, but he was also an inveterate gambler. And it wasn't like things are today where every result is right there on your phone, let alone on the internet or on ESPN or the baseball network or whatever it might be. I don't even think sports phone existed then, when you could call somebody and in 60 seconds, they'd rattle through something like an auctioneer and you'd hear every score imaginable. So we lived on Long Island. And if it wasn't the Mets or the Yankees or the Knicks or the Rangers, you couldn't get the games locally. But my dad would have bets going all over the place. So he'd give me the keys to the car. I'd be 11, 12 years old. I'd turn the ignition, not enough to turn the motor on, but enough to light up the dashboard and pull in out-of-town games. And as you guys
Welcome in, dog. Pepper.
I'm hearing stuff I shouldn't be hearing, but that's
Me too.
that's I guess the hazard of this stuff. But in any case, as you guys know, most major league teams were on the biggest station. You know, the Pirates were on KDKA. The Cardinals were on KMOX in St. Louis. The Indians were on 3WE out of Cleveland. The Reds were on WLW in Cincinnati. Ernie Harlow and the Tigers were on WJR in Detroit. So I would sit there fiddling with the dial like a safecracker, just moving it from side to side to try and pick up the games through the crackle and static. And then I would run back in after getting a sense of what was happening. And I guess that was my first reporter's job. And I'd tell my dad how his bets were going. And I fell in
Outstanding.
love with the broadcasters. It wasn't just the games. I noted even then as a kid, the difference in the styles of the broadcasters, and that interested me.
There's another guy, Greg Brown, who I think did the very same thing.
Well, I was going to ask Bob, I grew up to a degree listening to Bob Prince, but Lanny Ferteri and Milo Hamilton were my guys. That's
Mhm.
when I really fell in love with the Pirates, listening to KDK. How about you? What are some of the guys that you grew up listening to?
Well, growing up in New York, I was lucky. That was really the heyday of great New York broadcasting. So I remember Mel Allen on the Yankees. Red Barber had shifted from the Dodgers to the Yankees, so I heard the old redhead. I wasn't old enough to remember Vin Scully as a young broadcaster with the Dodgers, but we did live for a year and a half in the 60s in Los Angeles. So I was one of those transistor radio people listening to Vin. Lindsey Nelson did the Mets from their inception, and Lindsey was great to listen to, as was Bob Murphy. And then a little bit later on, but not much, right out of college, I'm 22, and I'm lucky enough to land a job at KMOX. So I'm not only listening to Jack Buck, I'm around him. And he would let me stand or sit in the back of the broadcast booth, kind of absorb what he was doing. And I hope I learned something by osmosis. So when it comes to baseball, those were the early influences. I also like the guys like Jim McKay and Jack Whitaker and Haywood Hale Bruin, who were kind of essayists, the literate sportscasters who had a way with language. Those are some of the people who influenced me. But Greg, as a kid, I can remember listening to The Gunner. I can remember, a home run in a phone booth or in an elevator shaft, and the green weenie to put the hex on the opposition.
Yeah.
I remember all that, and Milo too.
He was always snug as a bug in a rug.
Yeah. We need a bloop and a blast, right? To catch
That's
up.
right.
Bloop
That's
and a
right.
blast.
On the hill with Will, with a home run up there. Yes. So what is your love, Bob, of baseball history? You've published several books. Talk a little bit about, if you could, your just desire to keep this propagating.
I just fell in love with it as a kid, the way you probably did, Pete, the way Greg did. There was an element of distance then. There were enough games on TV and on the radio that you could follow it, but it wasn't coming at you from every direction. So reading about it was more important, and imagining it was more important. Watching it on a black and white TV or listening to it on the radio meant your imagination had to be engaged. And maybe I'm an old soul, but I liked reading. I remember reading a biography of Connie Mack and a biography of Walter Johnson when I was like 11 years old. And I was fascinated by the early history of baseball. I had a subscription to Baseball Digest, which still exists, but it was a different thing then. The Sporting News was the Bible of baseball. I remember having a book that my grandmother gave me for Christmas called My Greatest Day in Baseball. And they had all these people, Leo DeRocher and Pee Wee Reese and Hank Greenberg and whomever else, recounting what their most memorable day in baseball was. And then for Christmas, when I was about 14 or 15, and maybe you guys are familiar with this, there was a trilogy of books called the Fireside Books of Baseball. And they came in their own sort of elaborate casing. And it was a collection of baseball stories and essays and songs and poetry. And it included the transcript of Vin Scully's call of Sandy Koufax's perfect game in 1965. And I remember reading it as a 14-year-old kid. And I really thought it had been written after the fact because it was so perfect. And then I realized it was a transcript of his live extemporaneous call of Koufax's perfect game. And I said to myself, my gosh, this isn't just craftsmanship, this is art. And I don't know if I can ever come close to it, but I'd like to try.
Well, that's what's so neat about, and we've got that available tonight, the seasons of Buffalo baseball. What is it about baseball that allows these stories, unlike the other sports?
Well, the history is the longest. It's always attracted writers and documentarians. There's just more good stuff about baseball, and then oddly boxing, and to a certain extent golf, and back in the day horse racing. For some reason, they've attracted literary types to a greater extent than other sports do. And I think you know this too, working day in, day out, Greg. The pace of the game allows for storytelling. It allows for humor. It allows for anecdote and history and a relationship with your partner that the other sports that are more segmented don't. One of the things I've always marveled at when it comes to Doc Emmerich, who, as you know, is an ardent Pirates fan, he's the only hockey announcer, as great as some others may have been, the only hockey announcer I've ever heard who can work in historical and anecdotal material in the incredible, insane pace of a hockey game. But that only serves to prove my point. He's the extraordinary exception to the rule. Sports like hockey and football, they just don't allow for that kind of conversational stuff. Was Vin Scully really good when he did football games? Sure. But he wouldn't be Vin Scully in the minds of those of us in the profession and generations of fans if he had been confined to sports other than baseball. Baseball let his full artistry flower.
I liked it when these writers from other genres come into baseball. And in many ways, David Halberstam became my favorite sports writer from the books he did. First, he did The Breaks of the Game, of course, involving the Portland Trailblazers.
Yeah.
But then the outstanding books, The Teammates, October of '64. And that's just the beginning of what he did.
Yeah, Summer of '49 was the first baseball book of David's that I read. And luckily for me, I became friendly with him toward the end of his life. And he was as wonderful a person as he was an historian and writer. And I remember something he said about looking back on the summer of '49 and what fascinated him to go back as an adult. He was a kid then. And he said, look, sitting around the dinner table, did I have equal standing with my dad or my uncles to talk about the Marshall Plan, to talk about Truman versus Dewey? But my opinion about DiMaggio and Williams counted as much as theirs. And that's where I had standing in that conversation. And baseball hooked me, said Halberstam.
You know, with all that in mind, Bob, you've talked so much about the changes that baseball's been going through the last several years. Where does baseball stand in your mind? Are you concerned at all about the sport itself?
I am. I still love it. I still follow it closely. I've said this many times. Baseball's supposed to have a pleasing, leisurely pace. It's not supposed to have a lethargic pace. And this came to mind this past October, and I used the famous Pirate game in 1960 against the Yankees as an example. That game was 10-9, as everybody knows, won on the Mazeroski home run. It took just over 2.5 hours. This past October, the Yankees in Cleveland had an early round playoff game that also was 10-9. There was a rain delay, but we're subtracting the 31 minutes for the rain delay. That was just shy of 5 hours. It was like 4 hours and 57 minutes. Same score, 10-9, almost twice as long. Now, granted, it was an exciting and close playoff game. I watched every minute of it, but that's not ideal. And I think without getting too deep into this, Greg, and you know this as well, the analytics are helpful in building a team. They're important in making baseball judgments if you're a front office person or a manager or whatever. But very often what analytics tell you is best for getting a winning edge is not best for baseball as an entertainment product.
Bob, you came into Buffalo when the ballpark was brand new. Hard to believe, back 1988, 89. And you got to look at really what might have been the first of the retro parks, even before Camden Yard got going. Is that the way you like to see the way the game has gone back in those directions?
Yeah, you know, baseball certainly has to modernize, and it's changed a lot over time, over more than a century. If we're talking about the seasons of Buffalo baseball, it's supposed to change. Everything in life changes, but baseball at its heart is more about generational comparisons and is more about a certain feeling of nostalgia than other sports are. They all have their history, they all have their nostalgic aspects, but baseball just has it to a greater extent. So when people talk about progress, you have to evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis. Was AstroTurf and symmetrical multi-purpose parks like they had in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Philadelphia and St. Louis, was that progress? Not really. But when the retro parks came back and when baseball was played more as God intended it on natural grass and in quirky ballparks that couldn't exactly mimic Fenway or Wrigley, but were the best modern version of that sensibility, that didn't just please people with a traditionalist streak like me. Look at what the turnout was. Look at how it changed attendance in Baltimore with Camden Yards, or in Cleveland in the early days of the retro parks with Jacobs Field. So that's a back to the future thing that works better for baseball than for any other sport.
That picture there, the brand new Pilot Field at the time. And Bob, I think you brought Costas coast to coast to Buffalo a couple of times when the Bisons hosted a couple of, and we'll talk to Marta Hashevsky, who was instrumental in bringing those old timers games. But you talk about, I went back and looked at some of the highlights earlier today of some of the old timers they brought in. I guess that you interviewed at the time back in like 1989. The greatest of all time: Bob Feller, Willie Stargell, Joe DiMaggio, Luke Appling, Whitey Ford, and the list goes on and on. Do you remember those?
Oh yeah, and when you think about that time frame, Greg, it's a little bit like, and I'm not comparing myself at all, but someone like Jack Parr or Dick Cavett, they were relatively younger, especially Cavett, but so many of these legendary figures who predated television were still around. So Jack Parr interviewed Robert Frost. Dick Cavett interviewed Orson Welles or Jimmy Stewart. So that happened to me in sports, especially in baseball. People who I had either grown up watching or in some cases predated me, like Bob Feller or Luke Appling or DiMaggio. I had a chance to speak with them, to interview them, and in some cases become friends. But my gosh, I couldn't have imagined it, but I became very good friends with Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. I am to this day very good friends with Willie Mays and with Hank Aaron, and close enough to both Mickey Mantle and Stan Musial and their families that they asked me to do the eulogies at their funerals. When I was sitting in the front seat of my dad's car, as Pete mentioned, fiddling with the radio dial, I could never have dreamed that. So baseball is inseparable from the story of my life. Not that my story is any more important than anyone else's. I'm just blessed to have been part of it.
For our audience tonight, in just a little bit, maybe even after this question, if you see the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, we'll take some of your questions for Bob and then continue on with this before we have to adjourn to the next portion of our program. But just thinking about all those times you got to talk with those players, and behind you again, Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, but to those eulogies. I remember watching the live feed of you doing Mickey Mantle's eulogy, and you made a great note later about how one guy named Stanley Frank Musial snuck in the back and got involved.
There was a group of people down to the right, lower right as you looked at it from up on the altar, of baseball luminaries. Commissioner Selig was there, Whitey Ford and Bobby Mercer and Moose Scour and all those Yankee guys, many of whom would serve as pallbearers after the funeral was over with. Billy Crystal, who grew up idolizing Mickey, was there. Tony Kubek, my old broadcast partner. And so when you glance down to your right, you'd see them. And you know how it is when you're talking to a group of people, whether it's in a church or a speaking engagement or wherever it is, you look out over the crowd, but you're not specifically making eye contact with any one person. It's just something that you do. And I looked up at one moment and just happened to see out of the corner of my eye, about halfway back on the left, at the end of a pew near the wall by himself, Stan Musial. And I didn't know he was coming. And when I saw that in that split second, it all comes together. Here's what happens. This deeply decent person who had just gotten over a bout of prostate cancer, he's in his mid-70s by then, he got up that morning, went to the airport in St. Louis, flew into Dallas unaccompanied with no special treatment whatsoever. There probably wasn't a car to pick him up, hailed a cab or whatever it was, and there he was. And as I said in his eulogy, nobody would have marked him absent that day. He wasn't connected to Mickey directly. They didn't play in the same league. They didn't face each other in a World Series, except for All-Star games. They never played against each other. But he was Mickey's friend, and Mickey had deep respect for him. And that was just one of countless episodes in Stan's life that spoke to his quiet, unassuming decency as a person. Others have an aura about them, and it doesn't mean they were bad guys at all. Ted Williams was bigger than life. It was like John Wayne in a baseball uniform. And Joe DiMaggio was Joe DiMaggio. He'd been married to Marilyn Monroe, and they wrote 2 songs about him. And he was the Yankee Clipper and all those things. And so people sometimes would look, oh, wow, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio. But Stan Musial was such a regular guy that people in St. Louis viewed him like a neighbor. Hey, Stan, how you doing? And in many cases, he was their neighbor. He lived there for so long that you'd come across people in St. Louis who had a personal story. I bumped into him at the grocery store, or my daughter went to school with his granddaughter, which was true in my case. In fact, my daughter, Taylor, who's now in her early 30s, but then was a little girl, and one of Stan's grandchildren, his granddaughter, Lindsay, they went to school together from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So you know how kids, they have sleepovers. So she said to me once, Lindsay can sleep over here on the weekend, but I can't sleep over her house on a Saturday night. I said, why? She said, because on Sunday morning, her grandpa Musial brings them McDonald's. And so he's just like a completely regular guy. He'd show up with like a sack of Egg McMuffins. It was like their Sunday ritual. So when you saw Stan Musial, you didn't go, oh my gosh, Stan Musial. You went, hey, Stan the man, how you doing? That's just who he was.
Bob, again, talking about this book and talking about the past and the great players of the past, there must be the seasons of Buffalo baseball, and Bob Costas joining us. There must be a player or two or a handful of players that are playing now that a 10-year-old Bob Costas would love to go see and play.
Yeah, I think you'd love to go see Mike Trout play. I think you'd love to go see Tim Anderson from the White Sox play. You'd love to watch throwback guys like Justin Verlander or Garrett Cole or Max Scherzer pitch. A guy'd fight you if you came to get the ball when he was pitching well in the 5th or 6th inning. You might have to take it from him forcibly, and it wouldn't be easy. More recently, I loved Ichiro. Ichiro was playing a dead ball era game in a bludgeon ball baseball era, slapping infield hits, going the other way. And he had such a cerebral appreciation of the game. He was 2 steps ahead of everybody. And boy, did he ever love baseball history. He told me once that when he was in St. Louis for an interleague game, when he was still with the Mariners, he's in St. Louis, and he got 256 hits in a 162 game season, which is the record. But the record of 240 in a 154 game season had stood for a long time, held by George Sisler of the St. Louis Browns. And feeling connected to him, in the morning of a night game in St. Louis against the Cardinals in the early 2000s, Ichiro went and visited his grave in St. Louis to pay his respects. I mean, you gotta love a guy like that.
Can't go beyond that. Mitch has submitted this question in our chat room, and he remembered you coming to Pittsburgh for the re-debut after Game 7 of the 1960 series.
Oh, so great.
And what made the biggest impression on Mitch was how you spotted in the crowd Hal Smith and introduced him. And he was moved greatly by that.
That was so touching. Hal passed away only a couple of years ago. He was even then an elderly man, so unassuming. And the whole point of mentioning him and talking with him during that presentation was that had it not been for the Yankees scoring 2 runs in the top of the 9th, he would have been the lead story in every sports section in the country, not just in Pittsburgh, because he had hit the 3-run homer in the bottom of the 8th that put the Pirates up 9-7. Then the Yankees rallied for 2, and that set the stage for Mazeroski in the bottom of the 9th. And here was this unassuming guy who you never at that stage of his life, if you bumped into him somewhere, never would have believed he had been a big league ball player. And he just said so humbly, I'll never forget it because I had done something in a World Series that gave my team a chance to win. It was all about his team. And Greg, as you know, that was the 50th anniversary in 2010 of that 1960 season. And now we're up to 60 a decade later. But that team, Bill Verdon and Dick Grode, Mazeroski, Bob Friend, Elroy Face, Joe Christopher was part of it. They had a number of events during the year. So they all got a chance to reminisce and be reacquainted. And they came out of a different time and a different era. Many of them had served in World War II. Many of them didn't make a whole lot of money. But that shared experience meant so much to them. And then when you saw the appreciation at the Bynum Theater that night, and the way when we played the black and white kinescope of the game with Mel Allen and Bob Prince as the announcers, it was so interesting. The crowd reacted to everything as if it was happening in real time. They cheered when the Pirates did something good. They groaned when the tide turned against them or when the Yankees did something good. Michael Keaton, the actor who grew up in Pittsburgh, made the trip across country from Los Angeles to be part of it. The way stuff like that gets into people's hearts and imaginations, you have to experience it and just kind of it's one of those things where if you get it, and you don't have to explain it. If you don't get it, we could stay here all night and we can't explain it to you. But it certainly was real for everybody in that theater that night, including the players.
But especially Hal Smith, to your point, Bob, you pointed it out. You pointed out Hal Smith, and he got that standing ovation. That he pointed that out later before he passed away, that was one of the great moments of his life, that moment.
Wow. You know, Greg, until just now, I hadn't heard that specifically. I could tell he was moved that night, but that's very gratifying to hear that. And that, you know, that's the kind of thing that we can do on the Baseball Network. Just the other night, they showed Moneyball, and they preceded it with the hour-long conversation that I did back in 2011 with Brad Pitt, who played Billy Beane, and Billy Beane himself, and Michael Lewis, who wrote the book Moneyball, and Jonah Hill, who played the Paul DePodesta part. You know, you can on a network like NBC, for all the things they do really well, you're not going to have an hour to do that. But on a niche network like the MLB network, you can do that. Just this afternoon, they spent an hour talking about the Hank Aaron Awards and this year's winner. And Hank was on with them, and Tom Verducci did a wonderful retrospective about Hank's career, that kind of appreciation. So sometimes these days, you got to go to the smaller venues to do your very best work.
And I might point out there are a lot of Pirate fans on this Zoom call watching who are thrilled that the MLB Network did what they did for the Clemente Award yesterday. Yep. Really neat day.
Yep, Clemente Award yesterday, Aaron Award today, and tomorrow is the Frick Award, where they select the next inductee for the Broadcasters Wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame.
The challenge will be to have a speech as good as Bob Uecker's, but then that would be an unfair challenge for anybody.
And you know what? He did that without a single note.
Right.
He just got up there and I said to him beforehand, I said, you don't have to write a script, but just put down some bullet points. And whatever occurs to me. I guess he was right.
It occurred very well to him.
Yeah.
Bob, did you get the chance to go to War Memorial Stadium in Buffalo, or the other part of that from our chat room here, did you get the chance to talk with Robert Redford about him playing Roy Hobbs in The Natural?
Vin Scully invited me to, and I'd ask, why do I start this with Vin Scully? He invited me to the White House when he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom 4 years ago. And you talk about a star-studded group: Robert De Niro, Redford, Kareem and Michael Jordan, Ellen DeGeneres, I'm forgetting a whole long list of important and accomplished people. Bruce Springsteen, okay? So I spoke with Redford very briefly that day, and it wasn't the kind of situation you could get into an in-depth conversation. But I remember mentioning to him that Ted Williams was his favorite player growing up, and that's why he wore number 9 as Roy Hobbs, as the Natural. And, you know, he was 46 or 47 years old when they shot it, but still in good enough shape and still a plausible enough ball player to pull it off. And now, apropos of close to nothing, I'll tell you this little story, just because when else would I have the chance, since I mentioned that occasion. Everyone's gathered together waiting for the ceremony to start, waiting for President Obama and Mrs. Obama to show up and for the ceremony to start. And they were all allowed to bring a handful of people as their guests. So everyone's kind of shoulder to shoulder outside the East Room. And I'm sorry for name dropping, but it's necessary to tell this story. So I'm talking to Tom Hanks, and he's able to see what's happening behind me, and I can't. So he's looking over my shoulder, and Hanks is a big baseball fan. And he says, "What do you suppose that conversation is like?" So I turn around, and in the corner, by themselves, deep in conversation, Bruce Springsteen and Vin Scully. So Hank says, what do you think that conversation is like? And I say, Tom, I'll take a crack at it. You know, Bruce, I loved Greetings from Asbury Park, but you really hit it out of the park with Darkness on the Edge of Town. Foul back to the screen, 2-2.
Perfect.
You know,
Oh my
stuff
God.
just happens.
Absolutely perfect.
So classic.
But we have to ask you, are you not asked most about, of all your broadcasts, 1984, the Sandberg game?
Yeah, it's probably the greatest regular season game that I've ever been involved in. Very few regular season games have a name. The George Brett Pine Tar game does, and the Sandberg game does, and maybe a few others. And as you guys understand, and maybe younger people on this Zoom would not, the game of the week meant something different then. Now there's games everywhere. But if you were a baseball fan in Montana where you didn't have a local team, and you set aside those 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon, you didn't mow the lawn then. And all of baseball that was playing a night game, if you're playing a night game, chances are you were watching that game. On Friday, when you'd be hanging around trying to pick up some information in the clubhouse or at the batting cage or whatever, if the ball player saw me and Tony Kubek or Joe Garagiola and Vin Scully, they'd often say, oh, we're the game of the world tomorrow. So that game had primacy. The whole country was watching. That game got a rating equal to what some World Series games get now in a different world. And so Sandberg performs these heroics. It's what marked him as an MVP candidate, and he did actually win the MVP that year. It marked the Cubs as a legitimate contender, and it was the Cardinals against the Cubs. So that mattered. That's, you know, a longstanding rivalry, always a lot of red in the stands at Wrigley Field and blue in the stands at Busch Stadium. And everything seems to connect. You talk about Robert Redford and The Natural. The movie had just come out that spring. And so as Sandberg rounded the bases after the second home run, I said, maybe we're looking at the real Roy Hobbs. Maybe this is the real Natural, because if you submitted this script to Hollywood, they dismiss it as too implausible. And Sandberg himself, every time I've crossed paths with him since, that's the way the conversation begins. And, you know, Greg and Pete, you know this, we're lucky enough to just be there. If you hang around long enough, you're gonna luck into some of these moments, whether it's Michael Jordan's last shot for the Bulls or Muhammad Ali lighting the torch at the Olympics or the Sandberg game. And all you hope, fingers crossed, is that you do justice to it and don't mess it up. So if you can escape without messing it up, then you're lucky enough to be attached to something great that somebody else did.
Well,
Oh,
we are
great.
very
It's
lucky to
Bob
get a chance
Costas.
to you here tonight.
Yep.
Thank you.
I can hang for a little longer. Not that I want to overstay my welcome.
Well, you're welcome. We'll go
That's
until
music to
noontime
our
tomorrow
ears
if
and,
you want.
and Mike
Go-
Billoni's,
go-
by the way.
Go an extra 10 if you want.
Hey, Bob, Pete Weber said this show is probably going to go to breakfast tomorrow morning, but we know you have an early engagement. But if you want to take a couple more questions, I know Greg has one or two.
Sure.
That'd be tremendous, Bob. And again, we cannot thank you enough for doing this tonight with us. We've talked about players of the past. We've talked about the present day game and all the hits that baseball has taken. However, I thought Rob Manfred and baseball did a tremendous job in 2020 to get through the season, to make the changes they did. You've been asked this a lot, I know, since the season started and ended. But what are some of the changes you actually liked and might like to see put in place in 2021 and beyond?
I thought I'd have a problem with the 3-batter minimum unless an inning ends before 3 batters, but I was okay with it. And I like the fact that they didn't use it during the postseason, making a distinction between the postseason and the regular season. I didn't even mind 7-inning games in doubleheaders, at least under the circumstances. And I guess, I don't like this one, but I guess universal DH is coming. It's something that they can trade with the Players Association in return for other considerations, because the DH tends to be a higher salaried player, and maybe they add an additional roster spot or two. What are some of the other, what they didn't experiment with, and I thought they should have, I don't mind a 20-second pitch clock with no one on base. Clearly you can't do it with someone on base. When I watched a lot of the archival games that we showed at the Baseball Network, and I'm not talking about games from 1960, I'm talking about games from the 80s and 90s, Very often, if you count the first pitch, start the clock with the delivery of the first pitch, the second and third pitch were delivered within 20 seconds. So something has changed. God bless him, but Pedro Baez is walking around the mound, nobody on base, taking 30 seconds between pitches. Get on with it. We all have lives to live beyond this.
And just hope he isn't pitching to Mike Hargrove. That was
The human pain delay.
What
we
about
love
something.
Bob? What about starting that runner at second base in extra innings? Do you like that one?
Oh, yeah, I forgot that one, Greg. I didn't mind it, but I would prefer they started in the 11th, play at least one inning under normal rules, or even the 12th. And here's something else, and I realize it's a different generation. Those real marathon games, and you've done a few. I did one a few years ago with John Smoltz, the Yankees and the Red Sox. It went 19 innings. You remember those games. You know, they become part of baseball lore. I remember in that game around the 17th inning, we had a shot of a young woman with a Yankee cap and a guy with a Red Sox cap. And I think they each had corresponding T-shirts, but she was leaning on his shoulder as if they were well acquainted. So the purpose of the director taking the shot was, hey, we have détente here. Peace between Yankee and Red Sox fans. But my thought was, you know what's interesting, Smoltzy? Until the fourth inning, these two had never met. Now they're engaged. So, you know, baseball's quirky. I get it that we're in a shorter attention span culture, but as Joni Mitchell once sang, something's lost and something's gained in living every day. We might gain something by putting a runner on second base, might speed things along, but I think we lose that aspect of the epic game that becomes something we talk about years and years later.
Bob,
Hey,
one
Bob,
last from me. I want to ask you this one because he became close to you. Kirby Puckett and the effect he had upon your family.
Yeah, you know, I apologize if people have heard the story. Spring training 1986, and I'm having lunch with Kirby in Florida, and my wife Randy is there, and she's very clearly pregnant. And he says, do you know if it's a boy or a girl? I said, no, we don't want to know. We'll find out when the child is born. Have you picked out a name yet? Well, we've kicked a few around, but we haven't decided on anything yet. He said, how about Kirby? Works for a boy or a girl? So then I just blurt out, being, you know, a smart ass, I blurt out, you know what? Tell you what, if you're hitting 350 when the child is born, due in May, if you're hitting 350, we'll name him or her after you. Okay. And Randy's looking at me like kicking me under the table. What the heck are you doing? So it's like a Rumpelstiltskin thing, if people recall that old fairy tale. And I knew that prior to that, I think Kirby's, it was early in his career, his top mark was 296 prior to that. How did I know that on the due date, he'd be hitting over 370? But luckily, Randy was a little bit late, but not late enough for him to dip beneath 350. So I had to make good. So Keith, who's now an associate producer at the Major League Baseball Network, Keith has two middle names. His name is Keith Michael Kirby Costas. And people don't assume that Keith was for Keith Hernandez because we live in St. Louis, but yeah. Randy's younger brother is named Keith. And Mike just came from nowhere, but his name is Keith Michael Kirby Costas. It's on the birth certificate.
Hey, Bob, a question I have. A number of our viewers are obviously Bison fans, and they watched the Jays this past, or saw it on TV, the Jays. But tell us your view of Vlad Guerrero Jr. and what did you know of his dad?
I didn't know his dad that well. He was a wonderful player to watch, a distinctive and stylish player, now a Hall of Famer. The Jays lead the league in father-son combinations, maybe all time. In that, Bichette and Biggio and the Guerreros probably at the top of that list. And who knows, the way these COVID circumstances are playing out, maybe they'll be back in Buffalo again. And if they are, to the extent that fans are allowed in the ballpark and everything's up in the air now, that they'll be supported. Buffalo is such a great sports town, Mike. And, my connection to it does involve baseball because of visiting the ballpark with you and because of our friendship. But I also hosted the first Winter Classic, which was in Buffalo between the Sabres and the Penguins. And even though the Penguins won the game in overtime, it was on a Sidney Crosby goal, so you couldn't have scripted it any better. And the snow was falling. It had that snow globe effect, and the fans were completely, it might have been 35 degrees. That doesn't matter to people in Buffalo. That's a balmy day on January 1st. So they were like totally into it. And the first football game I ever did for NBC in September of 1980, the Bills broke a lousy streak. They had lost 20 consecutive games, either home or away, against the Dolphins. And Bob Greasy, former Dolphin quarterback, of course, called the game with me. And it was the opening game of the season. The Bills win the game. This usually only happens, when Ohio State beats Michigan or when somebody's on their way to the Super Bowl or something. But they tore down the goalposts because the Bills had finally broken the hex and beaten the Dolphins. So I'll never forget that game.
Well, interesting with that game, when you were there in 1990 for the AFC Championship and you gave the trophy to Bills owner Ralph C. Wilson Jr., in his box at the 50-yard line, he had two boxes. One was for his wife and all their guests, and one box was just him, elevated up with the window open no matter what the temperature was. So on that day when they took down and busted up and saw the goalpost, they brought it, literally surfed it all the way up the stands to his suite and gave him the goalpost.
See, and that's one of the things about sports in general. It's not confined to baseball. There's a local aspect to it. And now everything has become a national thing because everyone has access to every game and there's national sports talk. And I'm not saying there isn't still local allegiance. I mean, the Cardinals still mean something in St. Louis, and the Pirates and the Steelers and the Penguins obviously mean something in Pittsburgh, and the Predators mean something in Nashville for sure. But when we lose, and little by little we're losing some of it, the local flavor, we don't want everything homogenized. One of the things I remember about fiddling with the dial back in the 1960s was that every team was sponsored by its own beer. So the Pirates were Iron City, and the Cardinals, of course, were Budweiser. But the Red Sox were Narragansett, and the Orioles were National Beer. And they all had their own kind of jingle, these corny 1950s and 60s style commercials. When that local flavor is diminished by everybody having access across the country to all the same things, I think you lose some of the color and texture that makes sports appealing.
And Bob, thank you so much for your time here tonight. It's
Thanks,
greatly
Pete.
appreciated.